Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 SimPilot, and today we're going to be taking a look at the anti-ice systems on the Airbus A320neo in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. This will apply to any Airbus aircraft pretty much, although there are slight differences between the Neo and the 321 and the older style engines and that sort of thing. But it's pretty representative, and I thought it would be good to do it in Microsoft Flight Simulator just because we have these nice visuals of wintry effects to really give us the context that we would need to see how miserable the weather can be outside the aircraft. As always, this is not for any real world use, it's just for our use in Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane or whichever version of the Airbus you're using in your home simulations. It surprised me when I first learned to fly the Airbus, and it will probably surprise you as well, how little of the aircraft is actually anti-iced. So what do we mean when we talk about anti-icing? Well, we're talking about surfaces that are heated to make sure that they don't allow a build-up of ice. There are some de-icing systems on propeller aircraft, that sort of thing, but in jet airliners we typically talk about anti-icing. So on the Airbus, none of the tail has any anti-icing. It's not heated at all. So the stabilizer here in front of us, the fin, none of this has any heating at all. It's just got these metal strips at the leading edges, which look like they're heated, but they aren't. The same for the wing. We have the slats, and it's only the outboard 3 slats, so these slats here, that are actually heated, and that's only when you ask them to be. So there's 1, 2, 3. The sharklet isn't heated at all, even though it looks like it would be, but yeah, it amazed me. The engines are heated, so they have the option for this nacelle, which is the intake, to be heated, which is the sort of grey strip around the front. And the wings and the engines are heated using hot air from the engine bleed system. So we'll talk about that a bit later. At the front of the aircraft, we have some electrically heated items. So we can see down here, we have the pitos. So these are heated electrically, and they'll be heated pretty much all the time as long as an engine's running or you're in flight. The static ports are heated, obviously, because we need these to have free airflow. So if they freeze up, you won't get useful instrumentation, airspeed, altimeters, that sort of thing. Angle of attack sensors, which are here, these are also heated electrically to make sure that they don't freeze up, because we need that to be able to get things like stall warners and angle of attack information. There's another static port here. And finally, at the front, we've got... there's also some temperature sensors, which will be this sensor here. So this is heated in flight, but typically not on the ground. And then we have the windows. And we've got the windscreen, which is heated. And all of these windows are heated, actually, on the Airbus, which is quite nice, because some airlines don't heat all of them. But they're all heated, and then the windshield is heated in different power modes. It's got a slightly higher power mode in flight, which is great because in the Airbus it's very rare to actually see ice build up on it, whereas I've flown some other airliners with less suitable heating systems that may actually start to ice up. So there you go. The other thing that is heated is this drain mast down here. So this is a sink drain mast from the forward galley, and then there's another one of these. If I fly my drone to the back of the airplane, there's another one back here below the rear galley. And these are drain masts for the sinks, so they have to be heated because water drains out of the sinks and straight out of those masts. If they weren't heated, that water would freeze and then it will block the mast, and then the sink will be blocked. And it does occasionally happen if the heating system fails in these, which would mean you'd have to take that sink out of service, which is a bit of a nuisance, as you can imagine. So yeah, so those are heated. On a day like this, when you taxi out in your Airbus, there'll be a few things you do differently. I'm not going to talk entirely about winter operations because there's a lot to cover there. We're mainly going to focus on the de and anti-ice systems on the Airbus. But what I will say is, typically you would have to get de-iced. If it was snowing like this, the aircraft would have to be de and then anti-iced. So you'd have to have it sprayed with fluid to wash any ice off, and then it would also have another layer of fluid put on that will protect it for a while, and there's a certain time limit on that. So that will be done as you taxi out. You wouldn't set the flaps until you were fully de and anti-iced, and then you can put them out just as you're heading to the runway, just to make sure they don't get a build-up of ice on them either. And you wouldn't do your flight control checks until you'd been de-iced, because otherwise the control surfaces could have been frozen and that sort of thing. So there's loads of differences. Like I say, I'll talk about them in a video at another time. So for today, we're going to assume that this aircraft has been de and anti-iced, and we are within the holdover time, so the save time to then go and get it airborne. And we've also calculated all of this in our performance, including the surface of the runway, which, as you can see, is in a pretty bad way. but that would be something you'd have to account for in your performance calculations. Okay, let's go and jump into the flight deck and get ready for this departure from Trondheim. In the flight deck now, and you may notice some differences to your flight simulator. If you do, it's because I'm using the fly-by-wire A320 NX mod, which is a great community project where they are working to improve this aircraft by adding so far some ECAM pages, some FMA changes up here on the PFD and so on. I have a video talking through that, so I'll provide a link to that as well, but that'll be on my channel if you'd like help getting that or to see what that involves and what that changes. So there could be some small differences, but the mod does not fiddle with the anti-ice systems just yet. So we talked a little bit about how the aircraft would have to be prepared for the taxi out. We had to have de-iced and so on. Let's have a look at what we might set up in the flight deck now we have been and we're ready to take off. Well, on the overhead panel, we have this panel here for anti-ice. And certainly in these conditions, we're going to have the engine anti-ice on. If there's visible moisture on the ground or in the air and the temperature is at 10 degrees or below, we nearly always put the engine anti-ice switches to on. That then heats the intake of the engine, which I showed earlier. So that is something that the pilots have to do. It's not automatic, and we do it when the temperature is below 10. The temperature is this one, TAT. So when that goes below 10, that's the total air temperature. SAT is static air temperature. The total air temperature will be higher than your static air temperature when you're flying because the air gets heated up slightly when it touches the or gets compressed against the front of the aircraft. So that's why it's based on that, because we're only worried about the air hitting the front of the airplane when we're in flight. Typically that's where the ice will form. It doesn't really form on the sides or the backs of surfaces like it does when we're sitting on the ground here, which is why we have to be de-iced. Okay, so the engines would be on. The wing anti-ice push button only runs a test. So if I turn that on in the real aircrafts, you would get a little note on the ECAM telling you, but that's not modelled yet. But it would also just run a self-test and then it would stop. So it doesn't actually do anything while you're sitting on the ground. But once you're airborne, it will start putting that into the slats. So we wouldn't typically need to take off with the wing anti-ice turned on. The engine anti-ice, as I say, we would turn on. When you do that, it actually reduces the performance because these systems here all use air from the engines. So when you turn these on, it diverts some of the air from the high pressure compression part of the jet engine. Don't worry if you're not sure what that means, but it takes some of the air away, which means that your performance is reduced. It also means the engines have to idle slightly higher. So in the real aircraft, when you turn on the engine anti-ice, you'll actually see the N1 increase slightly, where it has to use some extra power to make sure it doesn't get into difficulty in the low power stages. So there you go. So that's typical of that. We also have probe window heat, and currently should be in auto. You can turn it on, but we nearly always leave it in auto. Now, as pilots, we don't really have to touch this. I don't know if I've ever had to use it because it's automatic. When an engine is running or you are in flight, the probes are all heated, the angle of attack sensors are heated, the windows are heated, and they automatically change over to the high power in-flight mode once you get airborne as well. So they're controlled by probe heat computers. There's also window heat computers that run those as well. So like I say, normally we don't have to do anything. So we shall see how the Microsoft Airbus behaves, because I understand that some people have found that they've had to turn this on. But in flight, it doesn't really make much difference. It's only useful on grounds to heat up the probes and so on without an engine running. Right, so wing anti-ice off, engine anti-ice is on, and then probe window heat is in auto, which is what you'd expect. Let's get ourselves airborne and have a look in flight. As we can see, the temperature outside, total air temperature now -4 degrees, static air temperature -10. So there's 6 degrees of heating from the air hitting the front of the aircraft and warming up because it gets compressed, which heats it up. Right, we're turning onto our route. Let's climb up to flight level 100. So I'm going to set that to 100 and set standard as we got out with flight level 100 armed. So this is very much in icing conditions. So what we would also have to do in this situation is look out the nose of the aircraft at the ice detector, which is just here. So there's a little stick that sticks out on the front of the cockpit. Let me show you from the external view. And you can see that there. And that is something that we look at. It has a little light in it, and we use that to look at the whether there's ice built up on the airframe. And if there is, then we would need to use the wing anti-ice. Now, I can't see it, but I can see here that I'm going to need to turn it on, because if we go to the external view, we get this picture. Now, this is frankly ridiculous. It's not a realistic situation. The ice doesn't build up like this. It builds up along the leading edge. So what you're more likely to see is a line of ice along these leading edge slats. But to see it built up, because the airflow brings the air around these parts. I've never seen a wing like this. I don't think this airplane would fly, and certainly the sharklets would not look like that. That's or the rudder. I mean, yeah. So it's a nice graphic, but it's not really representative of what you would expect to see. And if you've ever been a passenger on an Airbus, I highly doubt you've ever seen that, and I hope you haven't, because with this ice on the top of the wing, that really affects the airflow. It's very dangerous. So if that was on the ground, this would have to all be de-iced off. The only exception to this is there is a little area in the middle of the wings that does tend to get a bit colder, and sometimes frost can form on that in flight anyway, because it sits at such a cold temperature. It's a big piece of metal. I think it's for the landing gear, but I'm not entirely sure. An engineer will need to confirm what's going on there. But yeah, you don't tend to see it like this. The other thing about this is not only would it be very dangerous because you wouldn't really getting the laminar airflow over the wing here, it'll be incredibly noisy because you've got all this drag from all this frost around the nose and everything like that. But yeah, so that is not what you'd expect to see. You do occasionally see bits of ice. It's possible to see it form, but realistically, along the leading edges is where you expect it, which is why those parts can be heated. Now, someone's probably going to be able to pull out an example where this may have happened. I don't know, but I've never seen it. Right, if we go into the cockpit, we could see that this airspeed was going up and down there. It seems to want to give us a reason to use the anti-ice. So let's descend back down into the ice. So I'm going to go back down. Let's go back onto QNH, and we're going down to 6,000 feet. So the Airbus is incredibly capable. It is allowed to fly in icing conditions, which some smaller aircraft aren't. A lot of smaller aircraft aren't, in fact. But airliners like the Airbus and the Boeings are usually certified to fly around in icing conditions. And that is a huge part of why modern aviation exists, is the ability to fly in these conditions that were previously just too dangerous. So these jet airliners don't tend to pick up ice much at all. They fly too fast. Their design just doesn't really make them very attractive for ice, if that's a way to phrase it. I'm not sure it is. But some slower, smaller turboprops pick up ice more easily. But the jet aircraft tend not to be so susceptible to it, which is why only small parts of it are actually de-anti-iced. So like I said, this would be a typical situation. If we saw ice on that little stick here, then we would put the wing anti-ice on. Or you can look over your shoulder and try and see it. In the 321 that wouldn't work, but in a 20 it would, because you can't see the wings in a 321 very easily from the flight deck. And then we'd have the engine anti-ice on for sure, because the temperature is 10 degrees or below. Once that total air temperature is below -40, sorry, the static air temperature, SAT, is below -40 degrees, you don't really expect to get any ice build-up because it's too cold. Any moisture in the air is already frozen, so it tends to not stick to the airplane. So you don't need to use the anti-ice when your SAT is below -40 in the climb or in the cruise. However, when you descend and the engine's at low power, you would use it regardless, as long as you're in moisture. Remember, if we weren't in moisture, we wouldn't use any of this, but it's all about the moisture outside. So hopefully this is explaining a little bit of why aircraft can fly around in -20 degrees all day, and that's typically fine, but when they're on the ground, they have to be de-iced straight away, because on the ground, the ice forms in places it shouldn't be, but in flight, we should know where it's going to go. Right, I want to see what happens here, so speed out star, and let's see if we can recreate that issue with the airspeed. because unreliable airspeed is a very serious event if your speed goes up or down. It's rare, it can happen, but it's very, very rare because they're heated and specifically designed to make sure that they can keep themselves clear of ice. Whilst we're here, one thing to talk about as well is the normal ignition switch. I often see in Flight Simulator it sets it to ignition, but that's not really where it stays. We typically leave it in norm. When you turn on the engine anti-ice in the older aircraft, that would also start the ignition. So you don't need to switch this to ignition, it does it automatically. Ignition means it continuously ignites in the engine to make sure that if there is a sudden flame out, it's already igniting the fuel again. Which, to be honest, the Airbus has got a FADEC system that should really do that anyway. You might also use it in severe turbulence. So if you're flying around in heavy rain or severe turbulence, then you might turn that to ignition, and you'd get a little memo here usually telling you. Right, let's put that back to norm because we're not in heavy rain or anything like that. And let's see if we get any change to this speed. Whilst we wait to see if the speed does cause us any trouble, some other facts about this system. If you lose electrical power, which I show in one of my previous videos, managing complex failures, where I talk about the emergency electrical configuration, or the electrical emergency configuration, the losing of electrical power to the engines means that they will automatically open. So if the engine anti-ice valves lose electrical power, they will automatically open and heat the engine intake. With the wings, it's the opposite. The wing anti-ice system, if it loses electrical power, will automatically close. So that's just something to be aware of. So it does have a way of protecting the engines, but the wings will actually close because it's a big performance hit to have the wings anti-iced. It makes quite a difference to your fuel burn and everything like that. So it automatically closes. So in that situation, you'd need to stay clear of ice, really. You don't want to be getting any ice. There are some other situations where that's also true. For example, with an engine failure or some other electrical faults, you may need to get yourselves out of icing conditions. And the Airbus is quite clever. It's not modelled on here yet, but with any of the failure ECAM situations, it will actually warn you to stay clear of icing conditions. But like I say, that's more advanced. That isn't really shown at the moment. I haven't been able to make it recreate that speed loss, and its speed seemed to come back on its own, but I know other people have been having to turn on the probe window heat button in the simulator to then get the airspeed back. So if you find that happens, then that might be the answer. This little button here should heat the pitot probes. But like I say, in real life, even with this in auto, the windshields are heated, the windows are heated, the pitos are heated, it's all heated automatically. So hopefully that makes sense. What I want to do now is let's just see what happens if we leave the wing and engine anti-ice off. Let's see if it builds up any extra ice on the outside. As you can see here, we've got ice that appears to have formed, so not only on the top of the wing, but also on these pylons. And again, this is not realistic. You wouldn't see ice build up here because the way the air flows, it's not getting a chance to attach to the wing here. Possible overnight, or if the aircraft's been sat in frost overnight, that sort of thing, but not going to build up in flight like that. I would sincerely hope not anyway, because this is a huge amount of drag, and most concerningly, it's the ice on top of the wing here. Yeah, that would be no good at all. So for just a second there, we had the ice speed situation show. I've turned off all the icing systems just to see what Microsoft Flight Simulator does, and it immediately the speed dropped to 0. So let's see if we can keep descending into the ice and get that to recreate itself. Interesting. Like I said, the pitot should still be heated. There it goes. So that's down at 30 knots, or sorry, it's unresponsive. In the real aircraft, you'd get all sorts of other warnings now. You'd have to take out the automatics, and do the memory items for an unreliable airspeed situation, which, as I said, is very dangerous. But it seems in Flight Simulator, it's just a glitch where it needs you to turn on the probe window heat. So very interesting. If we look outside, so remember, I've now turned off all the anti-ice systems for the engines and the slats and so on, and doesn't seem to have added any extra ice out there. So there you go. Doesn't really make much difference to the visual graphic they've added, but we are definitely going to want to have these on when we're flying in these conditions, no doubt about it. Right, that's enough of this then. Let's get ourselves up and out of these horrible conditions. You don't want to sit in ice for the whole flight. It's definitely not ideal. There are other problems with it. Obviously, you burn extra fuel whilst you have to run all these systems because they take power out of the engine, which has to burn more fuel to replace it. It's also possible that if you have another failure, like I say, then yeah, you could be in a situation you don't want to be in, where you can't protect yourself from the ice. So we don't like sitting in icing conditions. It's just the aircraft is certified to do it. It's got very capable systems. It's interesting as well, it is possible on the windows in the real aircraft to sometimes, in really bad icing, to start to see a little bit of ice build up, but it doesn't seem to show up in here. So now we are clearly out of those icing conditions, so let's turn off the wing anti-ice. We don't need the engine anti-ice anymore, and this probe window heat would have been left in auto anyway, as I've said many times. As you can see, the total air temperature now -25, but the static air temperature is below -40. So at this stage, even if we were in moisture, as long as we were climbing or cruising, we wouldn't need to use the engine anti-ice. However, if we were descending, we would use it. Something you might notice if you don't put the engine anti-ice on is a vibration around the engine. So vibration M1 there says 1.9. That's actually quite high. It's typically below, well, it could be at 1.9, but usually it's below 1 in the cruise sort of stage, but it can build up a bit. But there you go. So the vibration could be a clue that you haven't got engine anti-ice on. You can get a build-up of ice on the fan blades, but that's a whole other topic as part of winter ops, because the fan blades themselves aren't heated. So hopefully that's given you some extra context about what these buttons do. So in summary, anti-ice panel up here, this uses hot air from the engines to heat either the outboard 3 slats on the wings or the engine intakes. We're going to use the engine intakes whenever it's 10 degrees or below total air temperature and there's moisture around. We're going to use the wing anti-ice whenever we see ice on the airframe. We've got the probe window heat switch, which controls the electrical heating and the computers. It is usually left in auto, but we can override it and turn it on. In the real aircraft, all that would do is allow you to turn it on the ground before you've started up an engine. But in the real aircraft, as long as an engine's running or you're in flight, that will run the computers and the heaters anyway. They run at slightly lower power mode, some of them are on the ground, but then in flight they're in the higher power mode, and it's all automatic. Otherwise, engine mode ignition switch, we only need to turn on if we're in severe turbulence or heavy rain, and we'd put that to ignition. So there we go, there's our look at the Airbus A320 anti-ice and de-icing systems. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about this airframe here with all this ice on it. I mean, that is, yeah, remarkable. So unrealistic, I would say, for the amount of ice they've shown in the graphics here. But there we go. Hopefully that gets updated in the future to something a little bit more sensible. As I said, there'll be more videos coming. We'll be looking at other systems in the Airbus, both in X-Plane 11 and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching. See you again in another video soon. Goodbye.